Hello everyone, my name is Geri Pilaca and I'm a PhD candidate at Apollo University Tirana, and my topic of presentation for the conference is Conservatism in Albania, Where Did it go wrong? As a start, I'm providing you with the outline of the presentations in which I provide the introduction and then I continue with a short introduction on conservatism, the political ideology, and then I continue with the Democratic Party of Albania and how it relates to the liberal conservatism. And then I move on to the two main case studies, which will suffice to my discussion on the application of the conservatist principles in Albania, and especially by the Democratic Party. And at the end, there is the conclusion and the references for your interest. Now, the conservative ideology in Albania has, at least de jure, been embraced by the Democratic Party, or DP, as I will proceed to call it in the upcoming slides. In fact, the Democratic Party, or DP, has proclaimed itself as a liberal conservative party in its main statute. However, some of his actions, whilst being a party in power in the previous years, has shown that it hasn't stayed within the lines of the conservative side. On the contrary, it has provided very contradicting actions which fall right on the other side of the ideology. There have been shown a more radical, or perhaps too radical, for a conservative party. And this has been shown in two main occasions: the land reform and the sea agreement. Henceforth, the study will explain the principles of the conservative ideology and which of those principles have been violated by the Democratic Party whilst being in power. And now I'm providing you a short introduction on conservatism. Conservatism is a political ideology which has many interpretations, but nonetheless can be said that its philosophical understanding comprises the preservation of tradition and negligence to changes. However, that does not mean that conservatism is against change or progress, as long as it is not based on abstract notions and that they do not produce unforeseeable outcomes. Moreover, conservatism has provided many nuances and understanding of what it's like to be a conservative and how they are perceived in various situations. Despite being a multi-layered ideology and having been introduced and applied in various ways in various countries, it nevertheless follows 6 common practices and beliefs. First, it rejects the rationalist viewpoint. Secondly, respects traditions or experiences. Thirdly, discusses the nature of the humans. 4, is skeptic regarding long political projections. 5, tends to preserve the institutions. And 6, is concerned about the authority. The importance of tradition and experience is stipulated by Ham, who renders them by issuing the notion of sentiment. For Ham, only the induced experiences or sentiments derived from past provide the basis for a true knowledge, and explicitly criticizes rationalism who tends to disregard experience. Moreover, Hum puts an emphasis on human nature, which, regardless of being associated with self-interest, can still stray away from selfishness, can make people engage into cooperation under legitimate government, and hence secure the property. Following the same line of thought, Burke expresses a disagreement over the use of abstract ideas, which would lead to radical actions that in essence would provide an ambiguous future at the expense of not expecting the presence of the institutions. The threat coming from nationalism was as well expressed by Oakeshott, who, besides restating what the previous conservative thinkers have assumed regarding the issue, has broken down the notion of knowledge in two parts: technical and practical knowledge, where the former is more preferable by conservatism and latter by rationalism. The liberal conservatism is one of the several divisions of the traditional conservatism, which is highly grasped on the idea of common morality, which is in the overall ordinance within the state, a natural legality, the protection and respect for tradition, and a society which is organically unified. Such division essentially supports the idea of small government, which in other terms is referred to the practices of not having a major interference of state authorities in the economy, but rather it supports the creation and expansion of a large private sector. In such sense, such ideas derive from liberal viewpoint on the freedom of the individual and the importance of the institutions in safekeeping these liberties. In combination with the conservative approach of respecting the tradition and historical institutions. In broad terms, the liberal conservatism is often being adopted by parties that are considered to be leaning towards the center-right and is more found in Europe and adopted by parties such as the Christian Democratic Union in Germany or Forza Italia in Italy. In the history of modern Albanian political system, the Democratic Party is considered as the flagship party during the country's reformation. Based on a liberal viewpoint on the economy, the Democratic Party, or DP, since from its election in 1999, has conducted mass privatization of the public assets, provided grounds for a free market, and put forward the program of land distribution, which will be discussed in the upcoming slide. These undertakings were as well part of the 2005-2009 and 2009-2013 terms, in which it was shown substantial effort in strengthening the private sector. More so, this economical policy was executed in the educational system, which saw a boom of the private higher educational institutions by the year 2012. Regardless of the seemingly applied liberal practices in economy and education, the DP has shown to have followed ambiguous choice in their ruling. Throughout the history, the party has reflected undemocratic practices despite recurring to liberal discourses. More specifically, it has shown that there was a lack of intra-party democracy, where the critics would be expelled from the party and the power was shared only amongst a small group of people. From a liberal standpoint, this is an example of a violation of the rights and liberties of the people in terms of expression of action. In reference to the authoritarian mentality that has been inherited from the former communist regime and was embedded within the higher ranking party officials, such way of ruling didn't in fact establish the propel cohesion and synergy within the population, as in fact it created a polarized society in terms of economy. It also created weak institutions and high level of corruption. Moreover, the responsibility to protect the interests of the people hasn't been as much visible as it was assumed due to the inability of the DP to avoid the fall of the Ponzi schemes when the state collapsed in 1997. As the liberal side of the party's ideological side has shown disturbance, the same thing has occurred for its conservative side, which took massive hits in the following two cases. The 1991 land reform that occurred in the newly democratic Albania has been one of the most recognizable malpractices of the political class during the last 29 years. While similar reforms had occurred in all the Central Eastern European countries, they differed from the one which the ruling Democratic Party had implemented in Albania. While in all CE countries the property was redirected to their righteous owners, in Albania there was a total redistribution of the property of a few landowners in the country to a large number of people. In 1991, the parliament of that time adopted the law upon the proposal of the Democrat Council of Ministers, a decision which overcomplicated the situation. Unlike what it was promised, the law provided the opportunity for the farmers who had worked in particular land during the communist regime to gain ownership of that land, regardless of being property of others. As a consequence, the former owners were to receive financial compensation for their respective lands, and later on, due to amendments to the law, the state would grant them with property situated in the coastal or mountainous areas. However, the compensations were dragged in time, and often would their lands be subject to unfair compensation or even illegal privatizations or altering of their borders. As a result, many people would turn to the European Court of Human Rights in most cases, and it would draw decisions in favor of the citizens and would force the government to spend millions of lakhs in order to compensate them. The negative outcomes that were generated by conducting this kind of reform in the particular way raised questions on the rationale of the Democratic Party or Democratic Party's decision making during that time. Albeit the DP has demonstrated conservative viewpoints on policy making in some cases, in this one it behaved more as a rational actor. The form of land distribution which was presented had violated one of the core principles of the conservatism, such as the respect for the tradition, which in this case it is translated to the ownership right. By essence, the property wasn't preserved, but rather it was spread on the basis of distribution of gains, which leans towards a more rationalist approach. In addition, the reform, which in itself it is a form of change or progress, turned to be quite radical rather than gradual, contrary to what conservatism supports. In 2009, the Albanian government, headed by the Democratic Party leader Berisha, engaged into talks with Greece regarding the sea border between the countries. At the core of the talks was the marking of the borders with the purpose of making such space to be properly used for economical activities, with having clear idea on the national jurisdiction's limits. However, the talks were kept behind closed doors and were finalized with the so-called Sea Pact, which eventually turned out to be not beneficial for Albania, as with the new marking, the country would end up with much lesser water space, while Greece would gain more. For that reason, the Constitutional Court, upon receiving the request of the political opposition coalition at the time, as well as of several experts, drew the conclusion that this pact has challenged the Constitution, mainly Article 3, 4, 7, and 92A, which protects the sovereignty and integrity of the borders of the Republic of Albania, as well as international agreements that are required to be conducted as the national law requires. Sovereignty and protection of the borders are incremental to states' identity and security, not only due to the fact that they are sanctioned by law, but also due to the fact that they have been embedded into political discourse across several countries for centuries. However, in current times, these decisions are seen to be fading in a more globalized world, which is also characterized by agreements that, for the sake of obtaining a common goods, the sovereignty and territory are sacrificed. In the case of CPAC, the government saw it as the opportunity to gain the vote of Greece for its entry into NATO, and by doing so, it was ready to accept a reduction of its water borders. While this action makes more sense from a rational and hence liberal standpoint, it is not acceptable by conservative ideology. The violation of constitution and of the national interest has undermined the importance that not only the traditional laws and customs, but also the idea of preserving them as the forms of institutions. Whilst it is true that conservatism does not necessarily claim that institutions can never be subject to change, it is still necessary to emphasize that such changes would have to be done partially and for the purpose of making it more adaptable as time goes by, as long as the core is preserved. The use of the conservative political ideology by the Democrat Party in Albania was revealed to be quite ambiguous and partial. While the concepts of tradition, property, and liberty find place in some of the practices of the party, they seem to be faded away in the cases of land property and sea agreement. It was seen that the land reform was in fact a radical choice to make, which was more rational than conservative, as the basis of it wasn't much the preservation of tradition rather than the idea of redistribution of the gains. As for the sea agreement, it turned out that the Democrat Party, while being in power, made a rational decision making by trading some of its borders in order to obtain a political gain. Lastly, its liberal conservative identity was put into question, as it was shown that the party behaved in an authoritarian way and occasionally failed to protect the interests of its people, and thus violating some of the ideals of its liberal side, the same way that it violated the ones of its conservative side. And here are their references for your interest. Thank you very much for your attention.